This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 205 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I've been playing fantasy football for 16 years, and I've been writing and analyzing the game for about 7. I think I can confidently say that I've never seen a fantasy football playoff like this one. And I generally get annoyed when people go out on social media and say things like, "This is the craziest week of fantasy football ever." Because the NFL is wacky. There's variance with this game. Crazy stuff is going to happen when we're playing in one-game samples. But after thinking about it, I really can't remember a fantasy playoff where studs got hurt, got released, or just didn't perform well at all. And when everything seemed just so different compared to the start of the year. I mean, look at the quarterback position last week. The top 20 quarterbacks in Week 15 combined to score about 325 fantasy points. That's with no teams on bye, meaning the quarterback pool was filled with everyone. That point total was by far the lowest that we've seen at the position this year. The previous low is about 383 points, or 58 more points scored. And the same goes for quarterbacks who finished in the top 10. Last week, top 10 quarterbacks combined to score 195 points. Before Week 15, the season low was 223. I mean, back in Week 4, you guys, top 10 quarterbacks combined to score 322 points. That's absurd. That's 32 points on average for a random top 10 quarterback. This week, the average top 10 quarterback scored under 20. And then on top of that, you had players like Keenan Allen, Aaron Jones, and Lamar Miller all leave their games early. Saquon Barkley, who entered the week averaging about 135 yards from scrimmage per game, had 56. Drew Brees had his third worst fantasy outing since 2012. It just seemed like these generally reliable players just weren't when it mattered most for your fantasy team. And that understandably put people on tilt. I mean, I was even on tilt. I had some brutal losses in Week 15 across my fantasy leagues, and it sucked. But when things like this happen, it seems like our response is always to want to change things up, and I get it. Fantasy football is obnoxious in that in a one-game sample, literally anything can happen. The best teams on paper don't always win fantasy championships. That's sort of how it is in the actual NFL because of this sample size problem. In the NBA, you're bound to see less parity because not only can dominant players really dominate games in the NBA, but you've got a decent 7-game series sample in the playoffs. In the NFL, it's one and done. We know how this works. We know upsets can happen when we're playing one singular game. Why do you think everyone loves the NCAA tournament so much? But like I said, because this season seems even crazier than usual, we're reacting by wanting to change how fantasy football is played. Instead of having the typical playoff in your fantasy league, we're getting people talking about only playing in points leagues, or best ball leagues, or only rewarding regular season champions. And I get that. I totally understand that as a reaction. I even have that reaction. But I do think part of the enjoyment of fantasy football is the variance. It's the head-to-head matchups that can go south. Because over the long run, you'll hopefully be enjoying just as many lucky wins as you will unlucky losses. The losses sting, but we also tend to remember the losses more. We forget about games where we won on a last-second stat correction. If you want the most fair fantasy league, then sure. Play an all-play league and don't have a single elimination playoff. I think that's totally fine. And I play in leagues like that because I like changing things up, and I want to be in leagues that decrease the luck factor. But remember that also takes out some of the fun in fantasy football. Variance isn't always this really awful thing. It's sometimes the reason games are entertaining. So I think things are just fine. It's fine that luck is playing some factor in all of this. We've also just run into a really weird stretch of games, and those games happen to have occurred at the most important time of the year for fantasy managers. So basically what I'm saying is, you guys do you. Find leagues that you want to be a part of because there are pros and cons to any type of format. Anyway, before we get going with this week's questions, I wanted to remind you guys about the weekly free roll over on FanDuel for NumberFire Podcast Network listeners. In the Week 15 free roll, KG0719 had a big win, topping the rest of the field by more than 17 points. Chris Carson, Derrick Henry, and the Falcons defense helped that lineup, and for winning, KG got 3 free months of NumberFire Premium and a bunch of free FanDuel points. If you want in on Week 16's contest, head to FanDuel.com/league/Brandon. That's FanDuel.com/league/Brandon for your shot at free NumberFire Premium and FanDuel points to be used on entries. This first question is from @KeepItLocked. I know this is a broad question, but where do you see the future of fantasy headed? With so many usable players each week, what changes should be implemented in fantasy football leagues to go along with the new direction the NFL is going? I think this is a great question, and it's one that we need to ask as this NFL game evolves. So first, I genuinely hope that more leagues shift to 2 quarterback formats. I know that Patrick Mahomes is giving you a nice edge in your fantasy leagues, but we should want the position to be more important. The more we can do to shift drafts from only being running back and wide receiver heavy in the early rounds, the better. It just allows for more flexibility and strategy. And I think your league should talk about the tight end position. I'm in favor of changing it to a wide receiver tight end flex spot, but I probably care about that less than the quarterback position. Because with tight end, at least you get interesting discussions around some of the elite players and when to draft them. And one other thing, and this sort of relates to what I talked about to open the show. I'm in favor of more overall spots in the lineup itself. If you truly want to decrease variance, more starting lineup slots will help because it will reward teams who are good up and down their lineup. If they have depth, they're rewarded, and a huge game won't be able to skew things as much. I really do hope that leagues start to do that a bit more, especially with there just being more usable players across the league these days. This next question is from @PattyJ38. How to approach the KC backfield in Week 16, assuming Spencer Ware goes? Yeah, so this is a really big question for a lot of you this week, and it's one that I have to worry about as well because I've got a lot of Damian Williams. The truth is, we don't fully know. We can just trust and guess how things will go down. But let's look at the facts. Damian Williams was great last week. Spencer Ware is banged up. Even if Spencer Ware is close to 100% on Sunday, I don't think we should expect the same type of workload that he saw in Week 14 against the Ravens, where he carried the ball 15 times versus Damian Williams 8. And we know that Damian Williams is a capable pass catcher as well. He had 6 targets last week, 5 the week before that, and 2 back in Week 13. So if Ware is active, and if we're talking about PPR formats, I think they're both RB3 type options. I wouldn't say Ware is significantly better than Williams either, just given the fact that he's been sidelined and Williams played well last week. And we know Williams can do a lot through the air. But if Ware is out, then Williams is a locked-in higher-end RB2. This next question is from @hey_men_412. This time of year, you hear a lot of analysts say you have to play X player because they got you here. Why is it acceptable to abandon statistical analysis during championship week? It's not acceptable, and that's not a smart way to think. Obviously, if you're talking about Ezekiel Elliott or something, you're playing him, but he's also just a good play. But the championship is no different than any other week. You shouldn't be changing your process up or playing guys that you wouldn't otherwise play just because it's the championship. Your goal is to still be optimal. Don't let fear dictate your decision making. This next question is from @WhatTheChain. Should I avoid playing guys on teams that have nothing to play for, like Jordy Nelson, David Johnson, Kenny Stills, etc.? I think people will overrate this aspect of things for a few reasons. First, the only way we'll know if a player is going to see less playing time because the team is out of it is if a coach or a reporter lets us know. So going into a game, you should have that information. If the coach screws you over, there's nothing you could have done. But it's not like that happens a ton in Week 16 anyway. But then on top of this, if you're coming at this from a motivation angle, we have no way of quantifying it. If Kenny Stills isn't playing for anything, does that mean he's going to run slower? I would argue no, because these are professionals and they have plenty to play for contractually. It's their job. And then the other point to make is that when you start to dig this deep, you start to make worse decisions in your lineup. Like, let's be honest, David Johnson hasn't really been playing for anything for weeks. Just because it's Week 16 doesn't change that fact. It's really, really important to read reports and see what player usage could look like, because that's really what we're trying to project. That's the same for every week. But if you don't see reports and there's no hint that a player will see less playing time, treat him as you usually would. This next question is from @PolishedTweeter. When you have multiple players, all with seemingly good matchups entering a championship game, what is your process for a tiebreaker? Trubisky, Baker, and Dak, for example, this week. Not asking for a friend. Thanks. I treat it the same way that I would any other game, and that's by looking at overall team situation, like their over-under, and then seeing if that player is playing at home. So for this in particular, you're probably looking at Dak or Baker, and then between them, it's really a toss-up. It may depend on who else is on your roster. If you want to stack Dak with Zeke, or maybe you have Jarvis Landry and you need upside, then you can go with Baker. And sometimes it just comes down to your gut and going with it when you see the two players as very close in projection. Chances are they're probably going to score similar number of points anyway. And for the record, I do like all three of those quarterbacks this week. This next question is from @IamTilting. Yeah, I'm tilting too. What does Cam Newton being out do to McCaffrey's production this week? I got this question a lot, and it certainly doesn't help. I know people may look at the situation and say that McCaffrey is now bound to see more touches, but that's not necessarily true. Because the Panthers are almost definitely going to be less efficient as an offense, and that means they won't be able to sustain drives. And without those sustained drives, we'll see fewer overall plays. But then on top of that, Carolina is now probably not going to score as many points as they would with Cam. This game opened up with the Panthers as 3-point favorites in a game total of 47.5. As of this recording, the Falcons are now 3.5-point favorites, and the game total has dropped by 4 points. You want your fantasy options to be in positive game scripts and in high-scoring games. You want them to be part of good offenses. So this whole situation downgrades CMC. He's still a must-start, but he's not as valuable. This next question is from @SomeDinoNoob. Are you in any leagues that you consider the ultimate fantasy football experience? If so, what features or factors make it so enjoyable? I think people believe that rule changes and unique roster setups are what makes or breaks a fantasy league. But the real answer is the fantasy managers. When you get 12 or 14 people who really have fun with it and are checking their lineups and they're willing to trade, that's when you've got a great fantasy league. I started a Dynasty League up with friends this past offseason, and everyone in the league is new to Dynasty aside from myself. I wanted to get them involved because it's a really, really fun format. There was a week where like 20 trades went through. It was just trade after trade after trade. And it was amazingly fun. Everyone was getting super excited, and it was what fantasy football is all about. Just people building rosters and engaging with one another. So to me, the ultimate fantasy football experience is about the people, not the league structure. This next question is from @CTJomas. There are a lot of defensive options this week, like Indianapolis, Denver, Dallas, Miami, Cleveland, etc. Which do you have as the safest and or highest floor? I think the answer to this is Miami. Every defense that's faced Jacksonville with Cody Kessler at quarterback has finished as a top 10 defense. Miami's at home, and Jacksonville is averaging fewer than 10 points per game with Kessler. That's the definition of a high floor. So they're probably the safest option, but all of the defenses that you mentioned should be fine this week. This last question is from @TheFirstPitch. What has been your biggest takeaway from this season that you will take with you into next season to improve your strategy and analysis? So I wanted to end on this one because this is something that I like to talk about after the season is over on separate podcasts. So once things have settled a bit, I'll be doing a show on things that I missed and things that I got right. But I'm also going to talk about the process on those shows. I'm not just going to say, I whiffed on Chris Hogan, but I'll be looking at whether or not it made sense to draft Hogan this year when looking at the evidence with a little bit of hindsight. So don't leave me after the season is over, you guys. There will be lots of podcasts during the offseason, and I promise they're going to be fun and worthwhile. To be honest, I love putting together offseason content. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And you can follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. I won't be in your ears until next week's Mailbag show, so I wanted to wish all of you a safe and joyous holiday, and I hope you bring home some fantasy championships. I'll talk to you next week, though, with another Mailbag show. Take care.